Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn the halachos of the Daled Minim, and specifically we have been learning the halachos that apply to the Esrog. Now I'm going to back up a little bit from where we left off last night because I just felt that I didn't do justice to part of what we did, so I'm going to go back just a little bit. I'm going to pick up today near the bottom, 2 lines off the bottom on Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis in Siman Taf Reish Mem Ches Sif Zayin. Now before we read the Mechaber in Sif Zayin, I'm going to read to you a Mishnah from Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis in Sukkah. Not going to read the whole Mishnah, just one little phrase here where the Mishnah says, Notla pit masai. If the pitum of the Esrog was removed, the Mishnah says the Esrog is puzzle. Now, right when I mentioned the pitum, we all have a preconceived notion of what the pitum is. It's that little woody protrusion at the tip of the Esrog that comes up out of the Esrog, has that little ball-shaped piece on top of it, which we call the shoshanta. And indeed, Rashi here on the Mishnah says, Notla pit masai, if the pitum was removed, Zakt Rashi Roish Esrog. That is the tip of the Esrog, and he quotes this Mipi Rabbeinu Yaakov, and he brings a raya from a Mishnah in Uktzin. Okay. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at Siv Zayin. Says the Mechaber Siv Zayin, Nitol Dadoi, if the dad of the Esrog is removed. What is the dad? Says the Mechaber, V'hu haroish hakatan, that is the small tip at the top of the Esrog, shesheshantoi boy, that has the sheshanta on it, that little knob-shaped piece at the tip of the woody pitum. Puzzle, the Esrog is puzzle. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, 4 lines off the bottom, Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis, Mishnah Berurah is Chav Tes. Nital dadoi, if the dad of the Esrog is removed, says the Chavetz Chaim, Hu ha'etz sha'al rosh ha'esrog, this is the woody protrusion at the top of the Esrog. K'mai chayid hadad, it's like the tip of the nipple, v'tachuv b'soichai. Now, this woody protrusion that we call the pitum, I want you to imagine that it's like a peg, and it's a wooden peg that is pushed into the flesh at the top of the Esrog. So, realize that the pitum is not something which begins at the tip and then extends upwards. The pitum is actually a woody piece that goes into, it is shakua, it is sunk into the flesh of the Esrog at the tip of the Esrog. The tachuv b'saychai, it is pressed into the Esrog, it's inserted into the Esrog. V'hashayshanta alav, and the knob that we call the shoshanta is on top of that woody stem. If this is removed, said the Mechaber, puzzle, the Esrog is puzzle, says the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan lamed, dahavi le kechaser. Now these 3 words of the Mishnah Berurah are really 3 fascinating words. It always fascinates me that the Chavetz Chaim, I think nowadays, the Chavetz Chaim is primarily famous for 2 things. He's famous for the Mishnah Berurah, right? This beautiful body of halachah that we have on Chelik Arachayim, and of course, Shmiras Haloshin. Those are the 2 primary things. When we think of the Chavetz Chaim, right away we think of Mishnah Berurah and we think of Shmiras Haloshin. Now, Shmiras Haloshin, to have the appreciation for Shmiras Haloshin that the Chavetz Chaim had, obviously the Chavetz Chaim understood very clearly the power of a word. And the Chavetz Chaim chooses his words so carefully throughout the Mishnah Berurah. The Chavetz Chaim says over here, why is it puzzle? Dahavi le ki chaser. Because it is as if it is chaser. Now, I could draw a contrast to you. We're going to see later in the shiur. If you look on Daf Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed Gimel, Over there, the Mishnah Berurah is discussing an esrog with the ukitz, the stem at the base of the esrog, has come out. Over there, in Ois Katan Lamed Gimel, the Mishnah Berurah writes, Dehu bechalal chaser. If the ukitz is removed, it is included in the psul of chaser. So it is chaser. That's what the Chavetz Chaim seems to say in Ois Katan Lamed Gimel. That's not what he says over here at Ois Katan Lamed. In Ois Katan Lamed he says, Dahavile ki chaser. It is as if it is chaser. Now, there's a reason for this. You see, if the pitum is considered an integral part of the guf of the esrog, we learnt on Kuf Tez Vav Amid Beis, in Sif Beis, you remember, we had two different opinions. We had a Deya Rishayna and a Deya Shniya. The Deya Rishayna in Sif Beis said, V'im chasar kol shehu pasel. When an esrog is chasar kol shehu, if it's missing something, then the esrog is pasel according to the Deya Rishayna, even if it's only chasar kol shehu. And yesterday, we learned in Sif Vav, we spoke about niklaf haklipa achitzayna. If a little bit of the very, very thin, the outermost thin layer of the peel of the esrog is removed, we said that the esrog is not necessarily pasel. It's only pasel if roiv of it was removed. If it was all removed. And the Mechaber said in Sivav, Niklaf aklipa chitzayna shalai she'enoi mechasroi. That's not considered a chisaron. Why? And the Mishnah Berurah told us, in Ois Katan Chav Daled, ve'ein kan chisaron begufay shal esrog klal. That outermost skin is not considered an integral part of the guf of the esrog, and therefore, if a little bit of the skin is removed, it's not chasar. Now, over here by the pitum, if the pitum would be considered an integral part of the guf of the esrog, then even if a tiny bit of the pitum would come off, the esrog would be chasar, and it would be pasel even in a kol shehu. Even if a tiny bit of the pitum came off, according to the Deya Rishayna in Sif Beis, that an esrog that's chasar kol shehu is pasel, so this esrog would be chasar kol shehu and it would be pasel. And yet we're going to see here in Sif Zayin that there's a whole question of how much of the pitum has to be removed in order for the esrog to be considered pasel. So very clearly you see that the pitum is not considered an integral part of the guf of the esrog. Again, because if it was, there would be no question of how much of the pitum has to be missing in order for it to be pasel. Even if a tiny bit is missing, it's pasel. And we're machmer like the Deya Rishayna in Sif Beis. So from the very fact that we have this question, it's clear that the pitum is not an integral part of the guf of the esrog. So then why is it pasel? Why is it pasel if the pitum is missing? So the Mishnah Berurah opens up Ois Katan Lamed by telling me, Dahavale ki chaser. It is as if the esrog is chasar. There is some element of chasar involved in this psul, and we're going to have to figure out what exactly does that mean. Why is it considered chasar? In what way is it chasar? And depending on how you answer that question, we're also going to answer the question of how much of the pitum has to be missing in order for the esrog to be pasel. So now let's see the Mishnah Berurah here. So the Mishnah Berurah said first, Tahavalei ki chasar. If the pitum is missing, it's as if the esrog is chasar, and that's why the esrog is pasel. Now, v'hine, milosha nital hadad. From the way the Mechaber wrote this, he said, nital dadoi. The dad has been removed. He doesn't say some of the dad broke off. He doesn't say the dad splintered, the dad broke, he says nital dadoi. The entire dad, the entire pitum was removed. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'hinei milosha nital hadad, from the choice of this language, mashma, the Mechaber implies, the nital ha'etz, that the entire woody piece of the pitum has been removed. Af mashe takua b'saycha esrig, including the very base of the pitum, which is sunken into the flesh of the esrog. The entire dad, nital dadoy, the entire pitum has been removed, including the base. And the base is recessed into the top of the esrog. Now, what's the point of that? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. Now that the entire pitum was removed, the nase sham k'moy guma. Now there's like a little hole. There's an indentation in the top of the esrog. Ulefikach puzzle, and that's why the esrog is puzzle. You see, if you're right, the woody pitum itself is not really an integral part of the guf of the esrog. So a chesaron in the pitum itself wouldn't be a chesaron kol shehu in the esrog, and it wouldn't puzzle the esrog. But if the entire pitum is removed from the esrog, now there's a hole in the esrog where the pitum was. A hole in the esrog, certainly it looks like it's chasar. If it looks like the esrog is chasar, so now the esrog is puzzle because heavy k'moy chasar. It's as if it's chasar. We can understand that. There's mamish a hole in the esrog where the pitum was. So it's true that nothing that's an integral part of the flesh of the esrog is missing, but certainly when you look at the esrog, you see a hole in the top. Heavy kichaser, and it's puzzle. Avol, however, continues the Mishnah Berurah, according to this way of thinking, avol, im nital rak masha lamala min ha'esrog, let's say the only part of the pitum that came off was the part from the tip of the esrog. In other words, the esrog that I've been using here for show and tell was an esrog that did not have a pitum, but I think I could demonstrate this anyway. If we look at this esrog over here that I have in my hand, there's the tip. Imagine if, you know what, maybe I could even kind of reinvent a pitum. We'll be a little bit creative over here, and we're going to make a pitum. I happen to have a handy little screw here. So here goes the screw into the esrog. Okay, there we go. Now, guess what? Now we have an esrog with a synthetic pitum. So, here's the pitum, and that head of the screw on top is the shoshanta. All right. Now, as you can see on the back end of the esrog, because I screwed this into an esrog that's cut, you see there's a little bit of the screw here that's sunken into the tip of the esrog. So we said, if the entire pitum is removed, so then there's a hole where the pitum was. If there's a hole where the pitum was, so okay, so the esrog is puzzle because havaleka chaser, there's a hole. Avol, however, said the Mishnah Berurah, im nital rak mashalamaylo min esrog. Let's say the only part of the pitum that's removed is the part from the tip of the esrog and up. But were I to cut off the screw over here, there is no hole in the esrog, because the part of the pitum that is sunk into the flesh of the esrog is still there. So the hole in the esrog is full. It's got the woody base of the pitum in it. So now, even though the pitum broke off from here and up, there is no hole. So the Mishnah Berurah is saying, from the language of the Mechaber, where he said, when is it puzzle? It's puzzle if nital dadoi, if the entire pitum was removed. The implication is that it's puzzle because the entire pitum was removed and now there's a hole. But if only the top of the pitum came off, so there is no hole, in that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, ein lahachmir. Then there's no reason to be machmir. Because what do you mean havaleke chaser? There's no reason to say that the esrog is chasar. There's no hole. The top of the pitum is gone. So what? That's not an integral part of the flesh of the esrog. So who cares if it's gone? That doesn't render it chasar. And there's no reason for the esrog to be puzzled. That's the implication of the Mechaber, says the Mishnah Berurah. V'chein hiskim hataz. And he says that the Taz agrees with this line of reasoning. Now, it happens to be, it's a very lengthy Taz. It's a lengthy, complex Taz. Not a simple Taz at all, but it's a complex Taz, and the Taz does reach the conclusion that indeed, if only the top of the pitum is gone, there's no reason why the esrog should be puzzled. The Chen Hiskim Taz Ladina, so paskins the Taz halacha l'maisa. Okay, so far we have over here in the Mishnah Berurah one opinion, and the Mishnah Berurah is pegging this opinion on the Mechaber. He's saying, according to this Mechaber, the way the Mechaber writes it, if the entire pitum is gone, including the part that's sunken into the tip of the esrog, then the esrog is puzzled. Why? Because there's a hole and hevel like a chasar. If only the part of the pitum that extends above the esrog is gone, then there's no guma, there's no hole, it doesn't seem to be chasar, it doesn't appear to be chasar. The part that's missing is not a part of the guf of the esrog, and therefore there's no reason to puzzle the esrog. Aval, however, continues the Mishnah Berurah, 2 lines from the bottom and middle of the line. Aval, however, yesh min ha-paiskim, there are those paiskim, and this is brought down by the Beis Yosef in the name of the Rabbeinu Chananel, a very difficult to understand Rabbeinu Chananel, and not a very especially easy Beis Yosef to understand. Aval yesh min ha-paiskim, there are those paiskim, shemitzadidim lahachmir, who want to take the side that you should be machmir, even in this case, where the only part of the pitum that's missing is the part that protrudes above the esrog, they want to passel that as well. The soivrim, and they hold, according to them, that is considered chasar. Now, why is that considered chasar? We said that it seems that the woody protrusion at the top is not an integral part of the guf of the esrog. So why would the esrog be possible because of chasar, even if just that is missing? I'm not 100% sure that I'm right in what I'm saying right now, but it seems to me from the amount of research I was able to do in the time that I had to prepare this year, that there is a svara where it's true that the piece of the pitum that's missing is not an integral part of the guf of the esrog, but one thing is for sure, the esrog is missing a prominent feature of the esrog. We all know that the pitum is a prominent feature of the esrog. When I was younger, there's no way my father, Olav Shalom, would have used an esrog without a pitum. No, he wouldn't even look at an esrog without a pitum. An esrog without a pitum? I'm sorry, an esrog has a pitum. You won't look at an esrog without a pitum. So the pitum is definitely a very prominent feature of the esrog. And if the pitum is gone, even if it's only the part that protrudes from the tip of the esrog and up, that's the visible part of the pitum. So when you look at the esrog, well, something missing. There's no pitum. Oh, it's okay. The esrog is kosher. It's an esrog that grew without a pitum. Esrog without a pitum? It seems to be chazar. So these shitas seem to hold that that's a problem. The esrog is missing a prominent feature, and therefore, heavy bechlal chaser lididu, they consider this to also have a problem of the psul of chasar. V'im, and now let's continue. V'im nishar mina eitz lamayla mina esrog kolshu. But let's say not only does the esrog still have all of the pitum that's sunken into the flesh of the esrog, let's say a little bit of the pitum that protrudes above the top is also still there. So the sheshanta broke off, maybe part of the stem of the pitum also broke off, but there's a little piece of pitum that's still there. So now, there's no hole in the esrog. It's also hard to say that the esrog is missing a prominent feature. It's not as if the pitum is not there at all. There is a little piece of a pitum. Okay, so it looks like it is a tiny pitum. True, the sheshanta is gone, but there still is something there. There still is a pitum there. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'im nishar mina eitz lamayla mina esrog kolshu. If there's even a kolshu of the pitum that remains extending above the tip of the esrog, das ha-Magen Avram de'ein lahachmer bazeh. The opinion of the Magen Avram is that in that case, there's no reason at all to be machmer. So essentially, if I had to wrap up Ois Katan Lamed, I would say that what we've seen over here is like this. We have basically seen I don't know if you want to call it 3 shitas or 2 shitas. We have the mechaber. What's the problem if the pitum is gone? The problem is if the entire pitum is gone, including the part that was sunken into the esrog, so that now there's a hole on top of the esrog. Have a like a chasar. It looks like the esrog is chasar. That's puzzle. We have the yesh min hapoiskim, which is the Beis Yosef in the name of the Rabbeinu Chananel, that says over here that even if there's no hole, because the part of the pitum that was sunken into the tip of the esrog is still intact and it's still there, so the esrog is level at the top. There is no hole. It's still puzzle. We're explaining that the reason that would be puzzle is because the esrog is missing a prominent feature. There's no pitum there. Then we have the Magen Avram who says a middle case. There's a little bit of the pitum still remains protruding above the esrog. Says the Magen Avram, in that case, there's no reason at all to be machmer. No reason to be machmer. Okay. Now let's go to the Ramah. Bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch, Kufta Zayin Amud Beis. Says the Ramah now, even weiter, even more chamer. Haga, v'yesh machmirin, there are those that are machmir, and he's bringing this down, I think from the Maggid Mishnah. V'yesh machmirin, there are those that are machmir, im nitla ha-shoshanta, if only the shoshanta, if only the knob at the tip of the tip of the esrog, the knob at the top. V'yesh machmirin im nitla ha-shoshanta, dahainu masha anu kairin pitma. He says that that's what we call the pitum. They're machmir even in that case. V'toiv lahachmir b'makom she'efsher, and it would be good to be machmir b'makom she'efsher. So again, what happened over here? Just the knob, just the shoshanta broke off. So that is essentially the case where the Magen Avram said there's no reason to be machmir, right? There's still part of the pitum still protrudes above the flesh of the esrog. The Ramah brings down that there is a ran, based on this ran, there's room for a chumrah, even if only the shoshanta broke off, the toiv lahachmir b'makom she'efsher. Now, we have to see right away, what does this mean? The toiv lahachmir b'makom she'efsher, that it would be good to be machmir if you can. It doesn't mean what you think it means. You think it means, okay, if I can get a different esrog, use a different esrog. Not what it means. Let's take a look at what the Mishnah Berurah says here, Ois Katan Lamed Aleph. B'makom she'efsher. What does it mean that it's makom she'efsher, that it's possible for you to be machmir? Hainu she'efsher likach yoser muvcher mizeh. It means that you're looking through esrogim and you have another esrog that's more beautiful than this esrog. Not that it's more beautiful than this esrog because of the lack of the shoshanta. No, you're looking at two esrogim. Excuse me. One esrog is missing the shoshanta, the other esrog still has the shoshanta. That's one variable. That's one factor. You want to know if that's an issue. Should I take the one that has the shoshanta? Says the Mishnah Berurah, that depends. Look at the two esrogim. Which one is more beautiful aside from the fact that this one is missing the shoshanta? If the esrog that's missing the shoshanta is more beautiful all around than the esrog that still has the shoshanta, says the Mishnah Berurah, that's not called makom she'efsher. Zeh keli vanveyu. We're supposed to use the most beautiful esrog that we can. If the most beautiful esrog that you could get is missing the shoshanta, take the esrog that's missing the shoshanta. Avalim hu hamuvcher. If that's the most beautiful esrog here, ein lahachmir b'shvel ha-shoshanta, you should not be machmir because of the lack of the shoshanta. Umikal makay, however, says the Mishnah Berurah, nire, it seems, the dafke im chaser raka shoshanta. That's only true if it's only the shoshanta that's missing. Aval im chaser gam miktsas min ha'etz, but if part of the woody base of the pitum is also missing, av sheyesh oid ktsas eitz labayla min ha'esrog, even though there still is some of the woody pitum protruding above the top of the esrog, toiv lahader likach acher im efshaloi, then, if it's possible, you should take a different esrog, ki yesh machmirin gam bozeh, Because there are those that are machmir against the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram said, as long as there's a little woody part of the pitum extending above the Esrog, there are those that are more machmir than the Magen Avram. And this is brought down in the Sha'ar Tzion, Ois Katan Lamed Vav, from the Maimar Mordechai and the Berurah Yaakov, and they want to say that even in the Magen Avram, you could see such a chumrah. So that's why the Mishnah Berurah says, no, if just the Sheshanta is missing, there's no reason to be machmir for just the Sheshanta. If it's the Sheshanta and part of the pitum itself, so now there's only a little bit of a wooden protrusion going up on top of the Esrog, then already the Mishnah Berurah says, better take a different Esrog. Okay. Continues the Ramah. Top line, Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. Miyu. Le'inyan dina halachah lamaisa ein lifsail ela imkelin nitel hadad. We're not going to render the Esrog puzzle unless the entire pitum is missing. Dahainu ha'etz sherosh ha'pitma alav, and that is the entire woody piece that the rosh ha'pitma, which is the sheshanta, is on top. V'harosh nikra sheshanta. V'chol zeh dafka shenitla, and now a very important Ramah. The Ramah says, realize, this whole halacha is only pertinent when the pitum has broken off or been removed or come off. But if the Esrog never had a pitum, it grew without a pitum. Many Esrogim grow without a pitum, like this one that I have right over here. Im lo yadad me'olam kosher, then the Esrog is kosher. V'chein roiv ha'esrogim shemeviim b'medinos elu, and he says over here, the Ramah, that most of the Esrogim that are imported into his regions, at least, were Esrogim that grew without a pitum, and those are kosher, even though they have no pitum. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Lamed Beis, kosher. The Esrog that grew without a pitum is kosher. Kevichekaki briasan, since this is the way it was created. V'zeu derech gidulan, and this is the way it grows. Ein lechanoisam b'shem chaserim. You can't call it chasar. If that's the way the Esrog grows, you cannot now call it chasar. Oy she'enon hadar, nor could you say it's not hadar. What do you mean? That's the nature of it. That's the nature of the fruit. V'nikarim heim. Now we have an interesting Mishnah Berurah here. The Mishnah Berurah says, "V'nikarim heim." You could recognize the Esrog that grows without a pitum. Ki yesh b'mkaim pitma k'may guma mitchilas briyasai. I already screwed a screw into the tip of this Esrog, so I can't figure out anything from this Esrog anymore. I'll have to get another Esrog from downstairs and see if I could discern what he means by this. He says there is some kind of a guma, some kind of an indentation from the moment it grows. The Kasam Berurah Yaakov says, the Berurah Yaakov writes, "Dezeh dafka rak sheyesh guma ma'at she'en kam psul rak bishum chasar." This is only when there's a small guma at the top of the Esrog, so that the only psul that would be here would be a psul of chasar. The kevin shemitkilas priyasa who came v'loy nasa mimenu klal loy mikri chasar. Okay, he's saying like this. He says, this whole halacha that we're saying here, that if the Esrog grew without a pitum, the Esrog is kosher. Says the Berurah Yaakov, what is it that we're saying? What we're saying is, despite the fact that there's no pitum, and despite the fact that now that there's no pitum, there is a little bit of a guma, there is a little bit of an indentation in the top of the Esrog, still the Esrog is kosher because it grew that way. And since it grew that way, we cannot call it chasar. It's not lacking anything, it grew that way. However, says the Berurah Yaakov, aval, however, lipa'amim, sometimes, yesh guma amuka, sometimes when an Esrog grows without a pitum, there ends up being a deep hole, shechalala ad chadrei hazera, a hole that goes all the way to the center, or almost it goes deep into the Esrog, to the fleshy part of the Esrog. Remember what we spoke about, the chadrei hazera. Sometimes you can end up, when you have no pitum, he says, you can end up with a hole that goes all the way down to the Chadrei Azera. In that case, says the Berurah Yaakov, first he says v'nikar, and we could recognize such an esrog that has a hole that goes deep like that. Al yedei sheyachnis l'seicha cholol machat oishar davar dak. You could test it by taking a thin needle or something else and sticking it down into the esrog and seeing how far down does it go. If it goes very far down, it's going all the way to the Chadrei Azera. But then nira de psul gomeru. That the Berurah Yaakov says is pasul gomer, even though it grew that way. Shaharei nekev b'toilada pasul kol heiche denikav pasul. He gives us a rule over here. We learned already that there are different types of nikavim, there are different types of holes in the esrog that render the esrog pasul. One of them that we saw in Siv Gimel is a nekev mefulish, and according to the more machmir shita in Siv Gimel, we said a nekev mefulish is a hole that goes all the way to the Chadrei Azera. Even if it doesn't go all the way through the esrog, if it penetrates all the way to the Chadrei Azera, that's pasul. Says the Berurah Yaakov, a nekev b'toilada, a nekev that the esrog grew with that nekev, is pasul if it's the type of nekev that renders an esrog pasul if it happens later. Now, a nekev that goes all the way to the Chadrei Azera, pasuls the esrog. So therefore, even if the esrog grew with a nekev that goes all the way to the Chadrei Azera, the esrog is pasul. So he says, if the esrog grew without a pitum, and by virtue of the fact that it grew without a pitum, it has a nekev that goes all the way to the Chadrei Azera, that esrog is pasul because of that hole. K'de'isa b'yaredeya Siman mem gimel b'pri megadim. And this is a reference to an animal again that has a lung, that has a sircha, a hole in the lung. The keven de nikav al Chadrei Azera pasul huadin benikav b'toilad. Okay, a somewhat complicated sif, but I'm very happy that I started again from the beginning of Sif Zion, especially the subject of an esrog where the pitum breaks off is a very common shaila. Those that like to use an esrog with a pitum, this is something that comes up very often. So I'm happy to start again from the beginning of Sif Zion and cover it in a more thorough fashion. Now we're on Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, 3 lines down near the end of the line. Ois Kat Neches. Nital ha'etz shehu tali by ba'ilan. How about if the woody piece that the esrog hangs from the tree with, the point of attachment to the tree, how about if that falls off? That, Rabbi Zai, is a reference to the ukitz, this piece over here. Now, you can't really see what it looks like on the inside of the esrog, even though I cut it open, can't really see it. But this is the piece that we're talking about right here, and I'll hold the esrog like this. I think you can even see it better. You know what? Let's do... Okay, that helps. You have the contrast now. It's that piece right over there. That is the ukitz. Okay. So, nital echu tali boy ba'ilan. If that woody piece, the ukitz, that's the point at which it hangs from the tree, if that is removed, may ikar ha'esrig, that is an ikar part of the esrig. V'nishar b'kaimai guma. I'm not sure. You know what? I'm questioning now if that's what my ikar ha'esrig means. Might mean from the root of the esrig. V'nishar b'kaimai guma. And now, because you removed the ukitz, there's a hole. Pasul, the esrig is pasul. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Lamed Gimel, V'nishar mekaymai guma pasul, d'hu b'chlal chaser. Because now, if that is missing, that is called chaser. V'emu shasat chak, she'en acher ba'ir. If it's a shasat chak, you don't have another esrig in the city. Helo b'tshuvas chacham tzvi. In the Tshuvas Chacham Tzvi, it says, Sheyachal levarech alav afilu b'yom rishon. You can make a bracha on that esrog that's missing the ukitz, even on the first day of Yom Tov when Dal Minim is Daraisa. Why? He explains here in the parentheses, Kevin Shevashasat Chak Issa B'Soif Sivan Tafresh Mem Tes Shem Evarchen Afilu Al Psulu Legamri. We're going to see later in Tafresh Mem Tes a shita that on a Shasat Chak you can make a bracha even on something that's mamish puzzle. The cholshkein bazeshu tali b'shita sarishonim. Certainly, and this with a loss of the ukitz is a machlokes rishonim. Kemavur beveis Yosef. V'hu adin benitla pitmasai v'naseguma ve'ein acher be'ir. You should know the same halacha would be if the pitum, the entire pitum, came off and there's a hole in the top of the esrog. Ve'ein acher be'ir, and you don't have another esrog. Gam ken yochel avarach alav afilu b'yom rishon. You can make a bracha on that esrog even on the first day of Yom Tov. Now, I just want to clue you in over here, because this Mishnah Berurah just pointed out that really this subject of an esrog that lost the pitum is really a machlokes rishonim whether there's a problem at all. Now, again, I'll go back to the Mishnah in Sukkah on Lamed Daled Amud Beis, and you'll see something which you'll be a little bit taken aback. The Mishnah says, Natla pit masai, if the pitum was removed, then the Mishnah said the esrog is puzzle. Natal uktzai, if the ukitz was removed, kosher. The esrog is kosher. So we seem to have a Mishnah here on Lamed Daled Amud Beis that says if the ukitz is gone, the esrog is kosher. The answer is that there's a big machlokes of what the ukitz is. There are those that want to say that the ukitz is part of the pitum, and it doesn't mean the ukitz at all, what we call the ukitz. And the Mishnah over here that says natla pitmasai, it's puzzle, and natl uktzai is kosher, is talking about how much of the pitum, which part of the pitum was removed. But there's a whole machlokes rishonim here, whether or not if the ukitz was removed, if the esrog is puzzle at all. Okay, now let's go back into the Mishnah Berurah and let's see the Ramah. 4 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch, middle of the line. Hagah. Let's say only part of the ukitz was removed. V'nishar oivi kolshu, and there still is a thick part of the ukitz that is still there. Shekol roichav haguma mechusa, so that the hole in the base of the esrog is really filled. I guess I could break the ukitz off of this esrog at this point. Okay, so I just went ahead and removed the ukitz from the esrog. Okay, here's the ukitz, and I have removed the ukitz from the esrog. Now, I have to put it aside over here because this is an esrog that was actually used for the kiyum of the mitzvah, and we learned that the daled minim that were used to be mekayim the mitzvah, you don't just throw them down, put them in a place where they can be stepped on or otherwise. You have to treat it with kavod. So I'll put it away somewhere until it rots. But now I want to show you, now that I have removed the ukitz, as you can see, there's a little indentation here. Let me see the right profile where you can see it best. Okay, I think that kind of does it. You can see that there's a little indentation there in the base of the esrog. Says the Ramah, if there's a little bit of the thickness of the ukitz still there, so that the hole is essentially filled and covered up, kosher, then the esrog is kosher. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut Lamed Daled, v'nishar oivi kolshu, there's a little thick part of the ukitz that still remains. Ritzaner Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say is, nishar min oivi ha'etz b'saycha esrog. There is still part of the woody structure of the ukitz in the part that's tachuv, the part that's sunken into the flesh of the esrog. Shiur cuts her a little bit. Sheyuchal al kalpanim l'mali kal roichav aguma min avyoy, so that the thickness of the hole is filled up. After l'maylu min aguma loy nishar mashu, even though there's nothing that protrudes from the base of the esrog at all. So the hole that goes into the base of the esrog is filled up, but nothing protrudes out of the hole. Gamkein kosher, that's kosher. Desuloi mikri chasar, because you cannot call the esrog chasar. Okay, siftes. Also chazazis. Let's say the esrog developed like a blister. Also chazazis. Pirush targum oy yalefes. The targum, when the Torah Kedosha is speaking about the mumim of an animal for a carbon. It says a yalefes. The Targum says oy chazozon. So a chazezes is some kind of a boil or a blister. So also chazozes, if the esrog developed these kind of blisters or boils, says the mechaber, im bishnayim oy bishloisha mekaymos, if they developed on 2 or 3 areas of the esrog, puzzle. The esrog is puzzle. Now let's stop here for a second. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and limud hey, also chazozes. Now I think the Chavetz Chaim understood the value of a word. The Chavetz Chaim looked at the mechaber and said, also chazozes. If a chazozes developed, the implication is that the esrog did not have a chazozes. When the esrog grew on the tree, it had no chazozes. Now the esrog was picked. You bought the esrog from the used car, from the esrog seicher. Okay, well, due respect to any esrog seicherim that are out there listening to the shiur. My brother deals in esrogim as well, so I certainly mean no disrespect to those who sell esrogim. I'm just joking around. So you bought your esrog, and now your esrog developed a chazazis. You might have been tempted to learn the mechaber that way. Also chazazis. There was no chazazis when it was on the tree, and now it developed a chazazis. So now sometimes the esrog is going to be puzzled. But if the esrog had a chazazis while it was on the tree, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's derech gidulai, and maybe that's okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut lamid hey, no, don't learn it that way. Also chazazis, if it developed a chazazis, bein betalush ubein b'mechuber. It doesn't matter if this chazazis happened when it was betalush, or this chazazis was there b'mechuber, when it was still attached to the tree. Sometimes it's going to be kosher, sometimes it's going to be puzzle. And so then, what is the meaning of the word also? If the mechaber did not write also chazazis in order to tell us that he's talking about a case where the chazazis developed later, so then what is the meaning of the word also? He explains, Ela be'inan sheyiyeh gavaya mishar esrog. The point of the word chazazis is that in order for this blister or boil to be a problem, in order for the chazazis to be a problem, it has to be raised over the level of the rest of the esrog. We know that the esrog has charitzas and blitas, it has bumps. If you have a chazazis that just looks like another one of these protrusions, that theoretically could be okay. In order for it to be a chazazis, it has to protrude above, higher than the rest of the bumps and protrusions on the esrog. Ois kat lamid vav. The mechaber said, if you get this chazazis in 2 or 3 different places, it's puzzle. Why? Demersi kimenummer. Because now it looks like a spotted esrog. It looks like an esrog that's spotted like a leopard. You know, it's got a boil here, a boil here, a boil here. It looks all spotted up. That's not hadar, and therefore it would be puzzle. Now, there's a very fascinating. It's a little late, so I'm not going to read the Bir Halacha inside. But the Bir Halacha brings down a Kesef Mishnah. I have a Rambam here, so I'm going to read it to you because I love the way the Kesef Mishnah writes it. We have over here in Hilchas Lulav, Parak Ches, I believe it's Halacha Zayin. Yeah. The Rambam says like this. Also chazazis alav. If it developed boils or blisters on it, im bishnayim ushloisha mekaymos, if it happened in 2 or 3 places, puzzle, the esrog is puzzle. Now, this lashon is not the Rambam's own lashon. The Rambam is taking this from the Gemara on Lamed Hey Amud Beis. The Mishnah said, also chazazis, if the esrog developed boils, al mi'utai, if it's only on a small part, so then the Mishnah says it's kosher. If it's more, it could be possible. If you go to Lamed Hey Amud Beis, there's a Gemara. The Gemara says, of Chista. Davar zeh Rabbeinu Agadol Amroi. This halachah, Rabbeinu Agadol Rebbe said, Hamakom yeh be'ezrai, the Rebbeinu Shalom should be there for him, to help him. Lo shanu ela b'makom echad, aval b'shtayim u'shloisha mekayimos kosher. If they got boils on 2 or 3 places, the esrog is kosher. That's what Rav Chisda said. Amar Rava. Rava said Adarabba, quite the opposite. B'shnayim u'shloisha mekayimos, if it developed boils or blisters in 2 or 3 different places, Havalei kim in number, then the esrog is spotted like a leopard, upasul, and the esrog is puzzle. And that's how we paskin. And that's why the Rambam says over here, in halachah zayin, what I read to you. Also chazazis halav, in b'shtayim u'shloisha mekayimos, if they developed in 2 or 3 places, puzzle, it's puzzle. Asks the Kesef Mishnah. Also chazazis halav, in bebeza gimel mekayimos puzzle. Says the Kesef Mishnah, May olam hukshali. This was always shver to me. Bein begemara, it's shver to me from the Gemara on Lamed Hey Amid Beis, ubein bepaiskim, and it's also shver to me from the paiskim, like the Rambam. Hashta shnayim puzzle, if the esrog is puzzle, if it has a chazazis in 2 places, shalosh bebaya, certainly it's possible if it has it in 3 places. What do you mean 2 or 3? If you have it in 2 or 3 places, it's puzzle. Why are you telling that to me? Just tell me if it's in 2 places, it's puzzle. And then I know if it's in 3, it's puzzle. And the Kesef Mishnah says, V'loi matzasi l'shum mechaber b'zeh davar. And I don't see any mechaber of any sefer that ever discussed this. V'tzarech and it needs iyun. So the Kesef Mishnah is just, he's kind of, what's going on over here? 2 or 3? If it's in 2, it's puzzle. If it's 3, it's puzzle. He says, I had this kasha forever, and nobody talks about it. And apparently the Kesef Mishnah didn't have an answer either. So the Chavetz Chaim gives a shtickle an answer. In this Biur Halacha Dibra Maschil, B'shnayim oy b'shloishim mekayimos. And I'll just tell you outside what his answer is. He brings it down from somebody else. He says, what you have to know is that in order for 2 boils or blisters to be considered 2 separate ones, they have to be separated by something. If the 2 blisters would be mamish one right next to the other, then it's not really 2, it's really 1. So he says a svara, just looking for his words here. He says the point is that it has to be clear that there are multiple blisters or boils. If they're one right on top of the other, and you don't have at least a chut hasaira, at least the size of a hair, of normal flesh of esrog between them, then they don't look like multiple ones. And he says the same way you need a separation of that type between 2, you would need a separation between 3. All right, I'm not going to be able to explain it well outside like this, so I just refer you to the Biur Halacha, Dibra Maschil B'shnayim oy b'shloishim mekayimos. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be megan on God's Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shem should say Yeshua's for first parnasset shedukim tol as in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Pias Girl Tzedek b'mhera v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.